Okay. Let's see who's all here. Okay, maybe a few more people will join. All right. Just at a logistical level, let me say that I corrected the numbering of the folders in the files on Canvas to correspond to the class sessions that are listed on the syllabus. Actually, let me fix one other thing that I'm just seeing right now. But let's just look ahead, and I want to review the syllabus with you guys just very briefly, just to make it clear how the readings are indicated in the class sessions. Okay, so generally we're reading things assigned for the dates. So for today we read Rousseau's Discourse and Inequality. For Thursday we'll read the selections from On the Social Contract. So that's what this parenthetical 2-3 refers to there. And similarly, 4-5 refers to the two class sessions, Monday and Tuesday of next week. So we have the selections from The Wealth of Nations by Smith listed following those parenthetical numbers. And it follows from there. I realized there was a question posed by one of the students that the numbering was a little bit off. I think it's because there might have been a holiday class session missed last time I taught this course. Pardon me. And so it just lined up differently with the days of the week and the selections that we have. But that's just to clarify how we have the readings listed on the syllabus. Here, I'll also show you guys just the file folder, just how it shows up on Canvas so that we're just clear about where everything is. So under Files on Canvas, you get this drop-down menu. And so we have the syllabus and paper assignments, then we have the various weeks, class sessions. We have class session 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 through 12, that's marks. So under marks, we've got the Marks Engels Reader, we've got some other PDFs. Everything is in the Marks Engels Reader, but we have some other readings as PDFs. We'll have two readings from Lukács, two selections of readings from Lukács. We've got the full book, and then we've got the selections we'll be reading. And then we've got Korsch and Adorno. We also have two folders. One is the unfiled folder that is attachments to announcements in past iterations of the course, and then additional readings. And under additional readings are some of the excerpts from the Adorno we'll be reading towards the end of the course, but also some additional supplemental readings that I will make reference to as we proceed in the course. For instance, I mentioned that the James Miller quotation from last night is from an article, The Abyss of Philosophy. So that's included in the additional readings folder. So that's supplemental material. And some of the charts that we'll be using are also in the additional readings folder. Okay. So, to it. I will also say that we have our discussion threads, which we'll refer to in class tonight. The notes that some of you posted. Oh, okay, more than one person deleted their notes. That's unfortunate. Know what happened with that? So we had 5 people's notes, but now we have 3 people's notes. Okay. All right, so let's just begin with introducing the reading that we did for tonight, and that's Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, or the second discourse is what it's known for. And like the first discourse, it was written in response to a essay contest. This is something that was very common in the Enlightenment. They would have these essay contests where writers would respond to questions posed by a kind of jury committee that then would award prizes. One of Kant's essays that we'll be reading, What is Enlightenment, is similarly written in response to such a essay contest. So Rousseau won the prize for his first discourse. He did not win the prize for his second discourse, what we read for tonight. He did not win the prize for this one, although this one is far more famous and influential. Had a greater impact at the time and also subsequently. The first discourse also got him a great deal of attention because it won the prize. But the second discourse is really what's influential. Now, between the readings that we're doing for this evening and for Thursday, we're going to have 2 apparently very different Rousseaus. Actually, it's the same Rousseau, of course, but looking at things from different directions. So the Rousseau that we read for tonight is sometimes seen as the anarchist Rousseau, the Rousseau who is very critical of society, and we'll see very skeptical about all human interdependence, all social relations per se. By contrast, on the social contract, what we're reading for Thursday, he is sometimes seen as the totalitarian Rousseau. The Rousseau who is, utterly justifying society and society's power over the individual, to the point where part of his argument is to justify the death penalty in criminal cases because he says criminals are rebels against society, and since society gives individuals life, if they rebel against society, then society has the right to take that life away. So very, seemingly opposed views, but no, there's something very consistent here. Namely, something that we're going to be considering throughout the course, but starting tonight, what's the relationship between the individual and the collective in society? So you'll notice from the footnotes, he's got extensive citations, extensive footnotes to the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Rousseau he is a genius. What does that mean? He has a great capacity to synthesize a lot of different thinkers. So in this Discourse on the Origin of Inequality especially, but also in On the Social Contract, he's taking a kind of history of literature on society and combining it into his own synthesis. Going back to classical antiquity, but also through the Renaissance up into the bourgeois era. So he's kind of in active dialogue with Aristotle, Plato, John Locke, Thomas Hobbes. We'll see on Thursday there's going to be more of a active dialogue with the latter two, because these are the social contract theorists. So usually when thinking about social contract theorists, the classical canon is Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. Actually, they have very different positions on things. Rousseau and Locke are kind of closer together. They're both responding to Hobbes, but we'll talk about that on Thursday. So he is really coming at a late stage in the Enlightenment when he's writing. He's in the latter part of the Enlightenment, and so he's responding to a great deal of thinking about society and about European civilization in particular. One of the kind of controversial or notorious but also important thought figures in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality is the idea of the noble savage. This language of the Enlightenment of the 1700s, it's very unfamiliar to us. So they actually had a distinction that they made between savagery and barbarism. So we tend to use these terms in a kind of sloppy way interchangeably. We think of any kind of brutality as either savage or barbaric. Well, in fact, no, what was going on in the Enlightenment in the 1700s, there was a huge distinction made between savagery and barbarism. So we talked last night about the longue durée kind of grand narrative of history, the archaeological and anthropological view of the history of humanity. We looked at a major transition in human history was the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic revolution, when the predominant form of subsistence went from hunting and gathering to settled agriculture. Well, that's the distinction between savagery and civilization. Now, as it turns out, European explorers and colonists were encountering people, and this is why he uses a kind of all-Courant reference to the Caribbean, to the Western Hemisphere, to hunter-gatherer communities who continued to exist in the world after the agricultural revolution, but usually in geographically isolated places like islands or Australia or the Arctic. Right, so generally speaking, civilization displaced the hunter-gatherer communities. But it was clear that there had been a mode of existence before civilization, before the agricultural revolution, and that is confronting European civilization in the 1700s. And so the idea is something like this. What did humanity give up when it became civilized? What did it lose touch with when it became civilized? So that's why the savage, the noble savage, is kind of innocent of the problems of civilization. So I mentioned Plato and Aristotle as ancient thinkers. Plato's Republic, Aristotle's Politics. Aristotle is the one who coined the term zoon politikon to describe humanity. So humanity is not merely a social species, not merely a social animal, but the political animal, a political species. Meaning we are like other social animals in that we live in groups. We don't live in the solitary state. We'll see what Rousseau does with this, because he posits a kind of a thought experiment of a time in which humans lived in more solitary, like lone wolf kind of condition. Actually, that never was the case. However, it's a thought experiment. But Aristotle's idea was that we're not merely a social species, we're a political species, the zoon politikon, the political animal. And what that means is that we create an artificial community. We don't just live in a natural community, the way social animals live in a natural community. Why this is important is that the savage also lives in an artificial community. They're the products of what's called the human revolution, which occurred sometime between 100 and 200,000 years ago. So if the agricultural revolution happened 10 or 12,000 years ago, the human revolution occurred 100 or 200,000 years ago. What is the human revolution? Well, that's when humans went from being a social species to becoming a political species. Or we might say a natural species became a cultural species, meaning the human revolution is when humans invented culture. So they invented religion, they invented language, they invented art. All the things that distinguish us from the animals, meaning the animals don't have, and we're going to see what Rousseau says about animal faculties. Animals have much of the same faculties that we have, but we have certain faculties to a superlative degree. So quantity becomes quality. We are an animal species. We are animals. We are like the animals, but we're also more than any other animal species in certain faculties. Specifically what he calls the faculties of pity and perfectibility. Or the combination of those two faculties, pity and perfectibility, reason. So the idea is animals have cognition, animals have consciousness, animals might even have reason, but we have it to an extent that the animals do not. And we'll see what he does with these two components of reason, pity and perfectibility. But the idea is that it's with our reason, with our faculties of pity and perfectibility, that we created the artificial community that we live in. So the savage lives in culture, they have language, they have art, they have religion, but are not yet civilized. And I mentioned last night that from a Marxist perspective, which we have to keep in the back of our minds, even though it's anachronistic to try to read it into Rousseau, primitive communism, a classless community. That's what the hunter-gatherers had. Whereas the agricultural revolution introduces class society. It actually introduces a caste society, which is somewhat different from class in the way that Marx is going to be dealing with it in capitalism. But leaving that aside, what makes humans different from animals is our freedom. Meaning we are more free than the animals. We'll see how Rousseau accounts for that. However, in our freedom, we also create unfreedom for ourselves. So our freedom, we are free to create a cage for ourselves. And that's society. Civilization is a particularly complex cage. And really that's the issue. The issue is Rousseau is not alone. Many people in the 1700s, many thinkers, are really looking at their own society, their own civilization critically. And they're looking at the cage that humanity has produced for itself. And they're wondering how they can get out of that cage. This is where the term barbarism comes in. So if the savage is innocent of civilization, then what barbarism is a decadent civilization. Meaning it is a civilization that's gone wrong. And that's the view. The view in this bourgeois revolutionary era of the 16 and 1700s, the 17th and 18th century. It's very critical of traditional civilization, traditional European civilization, and the powers of traditional European civilization, the powers of the church, the powers of the aristocracy, the powers of the established institutions. So the savage is free in a way that the civilized, and especially the barbarically civilized, are not free. So one way of thinking about it is that the savage has freedom, has society, has culture, has art, has language, has all the faculties, has reason, is in this way closer to the state of nature, not in a state of nature, but closer to the state of nature. Whereas the barbarically civilized have lost touch with their nature. And what that means is that they've lost touch with their freedom. So barbarism is a decadent civilization. Now, this language is important. The reason that I'm spending so much time on it is that when we get to Marxism, there's going to be this recurrence of this Enlightenment idea, but with a change. And the change is this. So bourgeois society, bourgeois revolution, bourgeois emancipation, and we're going to see how it figures in Rousseau when he talks about being a citizen of Geneva in Switzerland. And he's thankful for that in terms of making him what he is. So he's from a more bourgeois revolutionary part of Europe, and that affects his view. The idea is that there's been a restoration of freedom, bringing humanity closer back to the state of nature, meaning the state of original freedom that had gotten lost in the history of civilization. But capitalism in the 1800s, in the 19th century, what we talked about last night, after the Industrial Revolution, capitalism is a barbarization of bourgeois society. In other words, capitalism is a decadent phase of bourgeois society itself. And so the Marxist idea is it's from Friedrich Engels and then later invoked by Rosa Luxemburg around the time of World War I, socialism or barbarism. So capitalism presents humanity with the choice of whether we're going to advance in our freedom to socialism or whether we're going to stay stuck in a decadent civilization that is barbarism. So again, the savage might live in a kind of cultural community without the elaborate institutions of civilization. So the savage might not have law the way civilized people have law, but the savage has justice. Whereas the barbaric people, the decadent civilized people, have law, but without justice. So they have a kind of formal structure of civilization, but it's lost the plot. It's without justice. And that's the way the Enlightenment thinkers in Europe in the 1700s, that's the way they're looking at their own civilization. They're looking at their own civilization as an unjust civilization, as a decadent, barbaric civilization. And they're really questioning and interrogating their own society at a fundamental level. So that's happening already, and Rousseau is a kind of radicalization of that. Meaning the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality is taking that questioning of one's own society to the most radical extent. Meaning he's questioning social interdependence per se. Even to the point of like the family, men and women, right? He's like, well, when men and women just encountered each other in the forests and, did what they were going to do with each other and then went their separate ways, that was great. But no, when they were dependent on each other in a family, that's when the trouble starts. All right, so he's questioning social relations per se. He's questioning social interdependence per se. But he's not questioning the social interdependence of a social species, the way animals might be interdependent as a social species. He's rather questioning the way we're interdependent or dependent or really enslaved in society as a political species, the zoon politikon, meaning this artificial community that we've created for ourselves. And that's why he has to pose this radical and really counterfactual thought experiment about the state of nature. He says, the state of nature may not have existed. He also puts it a funny way, when we were walking on all fours, meaning perhaps before we were Homo sapiens at all, before we were humans at all. So Voltaire, who's another important Enlightenment thinker, he wrote a kind of snarky letter to Rousseau. It's like, I'm reading your Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, and I'm having a hard time going down on all fours. Right? So the thought experiment about the state of nature, the state of independence, so a kind of individual, lone wolf independence, he says this may never have been the case. However, he's going to pose it that way in order to throw our current situation, living in a developed society, into sharp relief, into critical relief, to throw a critical light on what we might otherwise take for granted, living in a elaborate, developed civilization, thousands of years old. There's a lot that we might take for granted there that we might assume that we shouldn't. And so in order to be able to question everything about our society, he poses this other condition, the state of nature, as a hypothetical. Even though that condition may never have factually existed. All right, it's to be able to problematize our social relations, our society, to the most radical degree possible. That's really the purpose of the state of nature idea. I mentioned reason earlier, pity and perfectibility, the two dimensions of reason. So the first discourse that he won the prize for is about the origin of language and art and reason in this respect. So he's elaborating here something that he had already laid out there. So pity and perfectibility, these terms are tricky because they don't connotate to our colloquial meaning of those terms in English, because pity sounds like sympathy, and perfectibility sounds like moving to a condition of perfection. Those are misleading connotations of these words. Pity really means empathy, and perfectibility really means adaptability. It means our ability to change ourselves. So the animals, especially the higher animals, the more developed animals, the more complex animals, have these capacities. They have empathy and they have adaptability. But according to Rousseau, humans have these faculties to a greater degree than other animals. So we are especially empathetic and we are especially adaptable. And these are our two component parts of our reason. So how does empathy figure there? A lot of our reason, especially at a practical level, takes the form of imitation. In other words, how do we learn to adapt to our environment? We imitate the behavior of others. We imitate the animals. So he talks about how humans live in all different environments in the earth, And how humans learn to live in those environments is to adapt to those environments by imitating the behavior of animals. And we do that through empathy, by putting ourselves in the position of the animal, imitating in that respect. And we adapt ourselves, so perfectibility. And that's, he sees this as like the basic function of reason. And of course, animals do that too. Also, we could say this is how humans are socialized, meaning we imitate our parents, we imitate our peers, our siblings, we imitate others in society. That's how the individual develops, socializes within society, is through these faculties, through the faculties of pity and perfectibility, through empathy and adaptability. And our capacity to do that, we develop our faculties. In other words, we find new ways to exert our faculties of empathy and adaptability. We're constantly evolving in our faculties. So we remain the same animal species. We've been the same animal species for hundreds of thousands of years. So biologically, physically, we are the same as we were hundreds of thousands of years ago, but socially, we've changed a great deal, and we've developed our faculties. We've developed our faculties of empathy and adaptability for good or for ill. So we've exercised our reason, and that has brought benefits, but it's also created new problems, and indeed has even harmed us. So in our reason, we've created new ways of doing things that have not always been good for us. Right, so that's another cost of civilization, we might say, and another mark against a kind of barbaric civilization. That we seem to have lost touch with our natural capacities in a way that the savage is still in possession of. So again, we've developed ourselves, and we've done that in our freedom, in and through our freedom. We've transformed ourselves through the exercise of our reason, but that's been for good or for ill. I mentioned Nietzsche last night because of the self-overcoming, the Selbstaufhebung. So I will mention Nietzsche yet again. He has a book called Beyond Good and Evil. So what does that mean? Beyond good and evil, it means, well, we're constantly changing what we consider to be good and what we consider to be evil. Everything that we do now that we consider to be good, actually in other cultural moments in the past or cross-culturally would be considered evil. Everything that we consider to be our good values would have been considered evil values. And everything that other times and places might have considered to be good values, we would consider to be evil values. What does that mean? It means that we're constantly changing our morality, we're constantly changing our definition of good and evil. Our freedom is beyond good and evil, because our freedom is the source of both good and evil. And therefore we can't say that freedom is good or that it's evil, because it's both. Now, religion, by the way, I'll just make mention of the so-called Judeo-Christian tradition, not really, but the Old Testament from a Christian point of view, or Scripture from a Judaic point of view. Expulsion from the Garden of Eden. Why did God expel us from paradise? Because we exercised our freedom. We disobeyed God. God said, do not eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge. You can eat everything else in the Garden of Eden, but you can't eat that, the fruit from the tree of knowledge. The serpent came and seduced Eve, who then convinced Adam we should eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, and because they did so, they were expelled from paradise. Meaning, our freedom expelled us from the Edenic or paradise condition of kind of innocence. So our reason created all of our suffering. Our freedom created all of our suffering. Now, it's not to say that animals don't suffer. Animals suffer, right? But they suffer differently from humans. Now, the last term that I'll mention up front from Rousseau is amour propre. Self-love. Amour propre. Self-love, self-interest. Again, a kind of a neutral value. It can lead to good, it can lead to evil, both for the individual and for others, both for oneself and for others. But amour propre. And again, animals have it, and humans have it, meaning all animals act out of self-interest, self-love, and so do humans. However, we do so as we experience that in society. Meaning, and again, this is where he's radically questioning our social existence. We not only have self-regard, self-love, self-interest, self-preservation, but we also do so through the way others see us. Meaning, we don't just exist on our own terms, but we exist in social terms. Meaning, we cause ourselves to suffer based on our concern for how others see us. And that causes us to do things like lie and deceive, including lying to and deceiving ourselves. In a way that the animals never have to lie to or deceive themselves. They just are what they are. Whereas to be a member of society almost necessarily involves lying and deceiving others, but lying to and deceiving oneself as well. And again, that's a function of reason. Why do we do that? We do that out of pity and perfectibility, out of empathy and adaptability, but also out of amour propre, out of self-interest. So our self-interest plays out in society in a way that it might not otherwise as animals. Nevertheless, we can never go back to the state of nature. We can never go back to the Garden of Eden or paradise. In other words, the only thing that we can do is take the situation we find ourselves in now and try to change it. Meaning, we've reasoned our way into this horrible trap for ourselves in society, but the only way out is through the very faculty by which we got ourselves into this trap. And not only that, but we have to try to get out of this trap by working from within the trap. Meaning, we can't really escape the trap. All we can do is transform it. We can change society as members of society and hopefully get back to closer to our original faculties of our freedom, but we can only do so within the historical conditions that exist. We can't step outside of history. We can't undo all of history. We might fantasize about this, We might fantasize about some kind of zombie apocalypse or nuclear war or something where we're all reduced to the struggle to survive as animals in the world. But even then, no, we would have been doing so as formed by society. That's something that Marx is going to talk about. The Robinson Crusoe fantasy. That if we're cast out of society, well, guess what? We're not really cast out of society because we take society with us, because we are society, because we are produced as we are by society. And so we reproduce society even when we're by ourselves, even as castaways. We take it with us because it's in us, it is us, it's made us what we are. But there is this fantasy. It's a little bit different than the traditional religious fantasy of the Garden of Eden or paradise. The bourgeois era, and especially the capitalist era, accentuates this fantasy of dropping out of society, returning to a state of nature. But it's a fantasy. We have a very negative view of the society we're living in, but that really speaks to the particular problems of our society. It's not just, oh yeah, society kind of sucks. Well, it might. Rousseau is sort of saying society might have always sucked, but the way it sucks now, the way we experience it, has to do with the specificities of this society we live in, not society in general. Even though we might fantasize, oh, like all society is bad. I always like to point to two movies about the Neolithic Revolution, the hunter-gatherers versus the civilized. They're both kind of bad movies, but one is like an awesome bad movie, and the other is like a kind of a crappy bad movie. So the awesome bad movie is Apocalypto by Mel Gibson. The crappy one is 10,000 BC. In both of them, you have your innocent hunter-gatherer people who are captured and enslaved by evil civilized people. And how you know that the civilized people are evil is that they have pyramids and ziggurats, and they have like a hierarchy, and because they do these horrible things like, human sacrifice and slavery, and so that's like the drama of the story, is like the noble savages living in their innocent hunter-gatherer communities and then being conquered and enslaved by the civilized people. What makes Apocalypto great is that then at the end of the movie the Europeans show up. So it's basically the Aztecs conquering like a hunter-gatherer community, and then the people kind of struggling and trying to escape, and then it turns out like that whole drama is eclipsed by the arrival of the Europeans at the end. And it's just like, we thought we might escape these evil Aztecs who want to use us for blood sacrifice for their evil religious rituals, but then, oh no, here come the Europeans, and they got the cross, and right. So they're going to bring a new drama. But again, this is a fantasy that we have. We have this fantasy of getting out of this society, but in a kind of more indeterminate way. Whereas the real task is, how are we going to deal with the particular problem that we face, this specific society that has become barbaric, namely capitalism. So yeah, medieval society might have sucked, but it's different from the problem we're dealing with now. So it's a natural fantasy. The noble savage is a natural fantasy. Van Gogh went to Tahiti. And he was like, wow, these people are, much more healthy than Europeans and much more in touch with their spirituality and the meaning of life. So this is a fantasy that capitalism itself generates. Rousseau's living, though, in the pre-capitalist moment. So he's living in the bourgeois moment. He's living in the midst of the bourgeois revolution. And I'll say one last thing about that, although it will pertain more to the class on Thursday, the reading that we're doing for Thursday on the social contract. So I mentioned Adam Smith translated passages from the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality for the Edinburgh Review. Rousseau is extremely influential for both the American and the French revolutions that come later. But actually, it wasn't this text that we're reading for tonight that was so influential for the revolutions. It was the text that we're reading for Thursday, on the social contract. They need to be understood together, but it was actually on the social contract that led people to think, oh, we can have a political revolution, we can overthrow the state, the government that we have now, and fundamentally change it and make progress that way. Because he gives specific criteria for that on the social contract. How do we measure whether a state, a form of government, is legitimate or not? That question isn't really posed here in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. Okay, so let's look at the notes that you guys posted, and like I said, I am sorry that we're going to have a brief class session tonight, but we can continue some of this discussion on Thursday of the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality. All right, let's share my screen with you guys. We'll look at these notes together. So he's got some zingers. So I looked at with you guys. I went through now the kind of major categories, and when you're reading, you should always be on the lookout for what are the major categories that an author is deploying in their writing. And what are the specific meanings of these words, because they're actually going to be redefining terms in the process of making their argument. So they're going to be using terminology, using language in a new and different way. But here's a zinger. So, man is born free but is everywhere in chains. Man is born free but is everywhere in chains. Okay, so how did that happen? Right, so, that can sound like a kind of an amazing, like, haiku poem, kind of, profound, graffiti slogan. But, in fact, there's a dialectical thought that's being established there. Meaning, the reason we're in chains is because we were born free, as I mentioned earlier. So it's in our freedom that we've created this unfreedom. The beginning of part 2 of the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, has a kind of a breathtaking line to it. Let me just pull it up here. It just occurs to me it's related to man is born free but is everywhere in chains. And oops. Right, so let's look at this passage together. The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, to whom it occurred to say, "This is mine," and found people sufficiently simple to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. And by the way, this term civil society, it's actually bourgeois society. So this language of civil society means bourgeois society. Then he says, how many crimes, wars, murders, how many miseries and horrors mankind would have been spared by him who, pulling up the stakes or filling in the ditch, had cried out to his kind, beware of listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits are everyone's and the earth no one's. But, in all likelihood, things had by then reached a point where they could not continue as they were, for this idea of property, depending as it does on many prior ideas which could only arise successively, did not take shape all at once in man's mind. Much progress had to have been made, industry and enlightenment acquired, transmitted, and increased from one age to the next, before this last stage of the state of nature was reached. Let us therefore take up the thread earlier and try to fit this slow succession of events and of knowledge together from a single point of view and in their most natural order. Now, okay, the state of nature there, this is the other point. So the kind of original state of nature is perhaps different from the state of nature per se. So we looked last night at that chart of terms, the dialectic of being and becoming, the dialectic of nature and spirit, and I mentioned that nature, in this philosophical sense, in this metaphysical sense, capital N nature, means something greater than physical or biological nature, the way we connotate it in English. It means literally everything one is born into, everything that exists, everything that's a given, everything that is in this sense natural. And that would include society, culture, everything that is historically developed up to that point. So when he says this last stage of the state of nature, what he means is this last stage of history has been reached. So this last stage of history, namely that of civil society, or the society of property, of private property, which is different. So private property is different from the communal property of the peasant village, where people farm the land in common, and also the title of the manorial estate of the feudal lord. The reason it's different is that the village peasants can't sell their land, and neither can the feudal lord. So it's not private property in the way we think of private property. Land is not a commodity, it's not private property. So he's talking about civil society and the emergence of private property. And that has a very complex history. Again, it's in the footnotes. Meaning it's not like one moment in time when it came about. It rather fully emerges in the bourgeois era, but it has antecedents in the preceding era. So there's something like private property in the Middle Ages. There's something like private property in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But private property per se attains to its concept, to use a Hegelian phrase, in bourgeois civil society, which has a long history. It doesn't just happen at one moment in time. But it does ultimately emerge and predominate over other kinds of social relations in the bourgeois era. And so that's what that invocation of the state of nature means there. Again, it can be confusing. If you just keep in mind that nature also means history, it will clear up some confusion. Okay, so let's look at Acacia's notes. Here's some quotations. Citizens being ill-suited to their government and vice versa seems to be happening now, meaning today. I'm taking it. Is Acacia here?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi. Did you mean present day?
Yeah, I started with comparing with our present day. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Good. And you write, in my view, some part of the population has, in its search for more freedom, delivered us all onto seducers who will and are increasing our chains. There's a sense of being set up over the past several decades to become people unable to live without their masters. Here's an important point, because he does talk about slavery. Slavery is a major thought figure in the Enlightenment for thinkers in the 1700s, because they consider their own society to be a society of slavery. And they consider the task to be overcoming slavery. Now, it's ironic because this is also the time of a certain particularly horrific form of slavery, the transatlantic African slave trade. Not to say that other forms of slavery weren't also horrific in the ancient world or in contemporary other parts of the world at the time. But it is a little bit ironical. But nonetheless, it's there. And the idea is that slavery, even though traditionally it's understood, slavery was traditionally understood as about people conquering other people. So one people conquers another people, and if they don't just exterminate all of the conquered people, then they enslave them. So it's a function of conquest. However, and this is something that we'll talk about more on Thursday, that doesn't seem to be enough. Meaning, Rousseau thinks, well, just force is not enough to enslave people. So what's required for slavery is that the slave become dependent on their master. In other words, it's not enough that the master conquers the slave. The slave also has to be dependent on the master. Meaning, again, it's a social relation. It's not just a physical relation of force, but it's a social relation. Again, this is something that Marx is going to talk about. So, again, being unable to live without our masters. Wow. Okay, so that can be seen as and can be said to be something that the masters have done to us, but it's also something that we're implicated in, meaning it's something that we also have a share of responsibility in. Right. I don't know if that, Acacia, did that get to what you were trying to address there?
Yes. Specifically with the way capitalism is now, I think we hear, it's incomparable to slavery in the past, obviously, like we're much better off, but we hear the term wage slavery, I think, pretty often.
That's the Marx term, and we'll see that it's like an oxymoron in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning the term wage slavery is meant to be an indication of contradiction, because of course in this society slavery is illegal. Indeed, exploitation is illegal. Like, you can sue your employer for exploitation. And yet it clearly is an exploitative society and also an enslaving society. Right? So this is the tricky thing. And again, Rousseau helps us with this. Because you could say, okay, well, people are not directly physically coerced into their labor by their employers, and yet we're still enslaved. And so that's where this idea that Rousseau has, that even if the master forcibly enslaved people, that's not enough to keep them enslaved. Right. So again, problematizing any dependence, any kind of social dependence whatsoever, any interdependence. So you could also say, and certainly many others, not just Rousseau, were saying this at the time in the 1700s, that slavery also enslaves the masters. So slavery is bad for all concerned. It's bad for the slaves, of course, but it's also bad for the masters. Because you could say that the masters are also enslaved to the institution of slavery. Meaning they don't have a choice but to remain masters. So, they're dependent on their slaves, we could say, but we could also say they're simply dependent on the institution of slavery and are therefore unfree. Right, so it's the social relation itself that's the matter of unfreedom, rather than one group being free and the other group being unfree. It's rather the relation itself is unfree. So slavery as an institution is an institution of unfreedom for all concerned. Because if it's just a matter of, it buys the freedom of some at the expense of the freedom of others, well, okay. However, no, the critique of slavery is much greater than that. It goes far beyond that. So it goes beyond the way like Aristotle thought about slavery. Aristotle thought, well, of course, for some to be free, some have to be unfree. So only certain people can be free, and that means the vast majority of other people have to be unfree in order to allow those few to be free. Because that was the situation in ancient Athens. The citizens were a small minority of the population. It was men. So male citizens' freedom was the result of them having slaves and women in a subordinate position. But that view was being rejected by people in the Enlightenment and the bourgeois Enlightenment. That way of seeing things was being rejected. And slavery as an institution was considered an unfree institution that was bad for everyone, including the masters. It's much more radical than just slavery is bad for the enslaved. Okay, guys, unfortunately we need to adjourn. I need to go to my other students. So we will pick up where we left off on the notes. We'll go through these notes, and also we'll do the social contract on Thursday. We'll have a nice long class session on Thursday when we'll be able to dive into more of the details of on the social contract and move on, the discourse on the origin of inequality, as well as move on to on the social contract on Thursday. All right, have a good night. Enjoy the one day during the week that we have off, Wednesday. Catch up on the reading, relax, and I will see you guys on Thursday.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, good night, guys. Bye.